right, diving in today, and let's be real, we're wading into some heavy stuff. We're talking about life inside prison, and I don't mean the Hollywood version.
Right. We're going beyond the stereotypes, beyond the statistics even.
Exactly. We've got well, it's a pretty intense firsthand account to work with today.
Yeah, this isn't some theoretical debate. We're talking about real lived experience, and that's what makes this so compelling.
It really gets under your skin. You know, the source material we're digging into today, it features this guy, Darren,
Former long-termer, yeah.
spent years on the inside, and he doesn't hold back. Like, when he talks about this young guy facing an 11-year sentence, Guy's like, look, 11 years, that's not a timeout. You don't just gut it out and walk away.
He makes it very clear. That length of sentence, it changes everything.
Mhm.
You're not just doing time, he says.
It's like you're forced to adapt.
Yeah, absolutely. You become part of this whole other ecosystem with its own rules, its own pecking order.
It's its own world. And gee, he lays it out there. He talks about ending up on a wing with all these guys, been in there for years. He's the new guy, and every move he makes, they're watching, they're sizing him up.
Talk about pressure.
Intense. He even says people are digging up information on you, trying to figure out where you fit in, who you're connected to.
It's about survival,
But-
right? You got to know who to trust, who to steer clear of. And sometimes, he says, guys try to game the system. He calls it noding.
Node.
Yeah, like trying to manipulate situations, play people off each other. But it often backfires, he says.
Makes you wonder, what's the mental toll of living under that kind of pressure, constantly looking over your shoulder?
And that actually leads into another point G makes about the mental health crisis in prisons. He says it's like this forced contagiousness.
Wow.
That's his term. Like, he compares it to back in the day when hospitals were overflowing. They'd send mental health patients to institutions that weren't equipped to handle them.
And he's saying prisons are dealing with the same thing now.
That's his argument. You get guys battling their own demons, surrounded by others who are struggling. He paints this stark picture. Somebody blasting a TV all night, another guy making chicken noises.
It's like sensory overload on top of everything else. And it makes you think, how can anyone heal in that environment?
Right. If anything, it seems like it would exacerbate existing problems. And that actually feeds into another issue G talks about, the rise of synthetic drugs, like spice.
And he connects that directly to the mental health crisis.
He does. He argues that when they cracked down on traditional drugs, it created this void. Guys were still desperate to escape, to numb the pain, but now they turned to spice because it wouldn't show up on drug tests.
So they're trying to avoid getting into more trouble?
Exactly. They're trying to game the system again, but with even more dangerous substances. And it highlights this vicious cycle. The system tries to eliminate one problem.
But it creates another.
Exactly. And G's point is that all of this, the mental health crisis, the drugs, the violence, it's not happening in a vacuum.
Yeah.
He argues that prisons, the way they're structured now, they're actually creating killers, he says.
It's a strong statement.
It is, but he backs it up by pointing to the rise in youth violence. He's saying these guys get out and they bring that trauma, that anger, that violence back into their communities.
So instead of rehabilitation, it's almost like
Like a factory of despair.
yeah, and that's a scary thought. And that's what's so disturbing. It's like, what happens when those who are shaped by that environment, by that violence, what happens when they get out?
Right. It's not like they just magically leave it all behind.
No, and Guy seems to be saying that this is playing a huge role in what we're seeing with youth violence. And he gets into this whole thing about how the media covers it and how that affects our perception.
Yeah, he's really critical of what he sees as this disconnect between the national news and what's actually happening on the ground.
He says it's all about national statistics, national trends.
Which can be misleading, he argues,
Yeah.
because it doesn't capture the reality for people living in these communities where violence is a daily occurrence.
He uses this phrase, out of touch.
And he's not just talking about the media, right?
No, he's talking about people in power. The ones who are making decisions about these communities, but they're not living with the consequences.
And because of that, he argues, you end up with these surface-level solutions that don't address the root causes.
It's like putting a Band-Aid on a bullet wound, right?
Exactly. And this is where Guy's perspective gets really interesting. He starts talking about this culture of aggression, this idea that we glorify fighters over lovers, as he puts it.
Like might makes right.
Yeah. And he says it starts young. And it's not just kids, it's the adults, too. We're setting the example.
He even calls out parents, right?
Oh, yeah. He's basically saying we're teaching kids to respond to conflict with aggression instead of teaching them how to communicate, how to resolve things peacefully.
And he says something like, we're raising a generation that's...
Quick to anger and slow to understand. That's how he puts it.
And it's like, when you hear him say it, you can't help but wonder, are we part of the problem?
It's a tough question. But I think that's what makes Guy's story so important. He's forcing us to confront these uncomfortable truths. And it's not about pointing fingers. It's about taking a hard look at ourselves, at the choices we're making as individuals, as a society.
He's saying we can't just keep doing things the way we've always done them and expect different results.
Right. We have to be willing to change.
It's about, like, fundamentally changing how we see this whole issue, you know?
Yeah, instead of this us versus them mentality.
Right, like we're all connected somehow.
Exactly. And G makes this connection between, like, poverty, lack of opportunity, exposure to violence from a young age, and then this system that, let's be honest, doesn't exactly have the best track record when it comes to rehabilitation.
Yeah, it's a lot to unpack.
It is. And I think G would say that's the point, you know? We have to be willing to look at this from all angles, even the uncomfortable ones.
And to really listen to the people who are actually living these experiences, right?
Absolutely. The ones whose voices are so often marginalized. And I think that's one of the things that makes this deep dive so important.
It's given us a lot to think about, that's for sure.
It has. It's challenged some of our assumptions, pushed us to confront some hard truths.
Yeah, I mean, there's no easy answers here. But maybe that's okay. Maybe the first step is just asking the right questions.
And being willing to listen to the answers, even when they make us uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Because ultimately, this is about creating a society that's safer, more just, more equitable for everyone. And that starts with each and every one of us.
Well said. Well, that's about all the time we have for today. But this conversation, it doesn't end here. We hope you'll keep digging into these issues, keep asking those tough questions, and most importantly, keep listening to the voices of those who are most impacted.
Thanks for joining us.